say, I don't know, 2 or 3 decades, it just seems like manufacturing, at least from my view, it's like everything is like we kind of offshored everything. EPA, there's all these rules that comes up, and it's cheaper elsewhere. Like you alluded to earlier, labor hours. There's certain parts in Asia that labor hours are super super cheap, and so we've offshored a lot year over year for the last few decades, manufacturing to China mostly, and to a few other countries. Now, I think COVID was like a significant blip on the radar. Everything shut down, and we realized, like, here in the US, we realized, like, we couldn't get like masks. There are certain things we couldn't get, and it was kind of like, oh wow, this happened. We're kind of single threaded here. We're relying on other people. COVID since has been in the decline, and I think there's just been this new energy in manufacturing. Can you kind of speak to that a little bit, like revitalizing manufacturing?
Yeah, so you hit on something that is incredibly important, and that is COVID's effect on this. So for the last 10 to 15 years, a fallacy has been being accepted within the US. And that is that it is automatically more expensive to produce in the US, or automatically cheaper to produce in a low wage country. If you went back 25, 30 years, you're correct. The reality is the American manufacturing infrastructure was doing things the way they'd done it for 40, 50 years. And then all of a sudden, an extraordinarily low wage country comes online, and they couldn't compete one-to-one. It's simple as that. So it became cheaper to produce offshore. But where the fallacy comes in is that people are still thinking that way. Even though we have had the most incredible technological advances in the last 15 years, and we see them in every other industry, but for some reason, people don't correlate that with the manufacturing industry. When I was in high school, my teacher always told me, you have to learn how to do the math on paper because you're not going to have a calculator in your pocket every day. Well, my teacher was wrong. But this is happening.
Don't tell my son that.
Yeah. but this happened everywhere, and it happened in the manufacturing industry too. Is things got easier. We needed less monotonous labor hours. So the concept of we're fighting labor hour to labor hour isn't true anymore, because the automation in a low wage country and automation in the US, they produce the same thing. So now you've got transportation costs, you've got opportunity costs of having a lot of product out, and companies started to realize that, but everyone was afraid to test it. Years ago, Apple had written a report that under certain structures, they could produce the iPhone cheaper in the US than they could in China. And there were a couple barriers to entry, but everyone was afraid to test it. It needed a catalyst for people to be forced to test it. Enter COVID. The world starts shutting down. And you've got supply chain managers who have been looking out the corner of their eye going, this is possible. I think it makes sense to go in the US. But everyone was afraid to test. And then all of a sudden, the world told them, you must test this idea. And they started testing it, and they're like, wow, it actually worked. Hey, this is fiscally responsible. In addition to that, one of the scariest things is the last people to catch on to it are American entrepreneurs. Foxconn just bought a facility in Ohio to help build the Fisker. I mean, that is the premier Chinese contract manufacturer. And they're going, no, we're going to build those parts in the US. I mean, just think about that. So we're starting to see a lot of other countries come in and go, oh yeah, this makes total sense. We'll totally build a plant here. And it took COVID for a lot of people to be forced to look into it. And as soon as they looked into it, started going, wow, this is actually penciling out. Hey, I'm getting my life back. My engineers love it because instead of working all night to talk to foreign sources, they're just going to a plant in Indiana and looking at what's being done. So that really, that moment in time that COVID created was really important. And we had been saying it for years that it was going to take something to finally make people realize it. And we always thought it was going to be some major corporation that decided to try it and it worked out. Well, come to find out, it was the world stopping for a year.
For anyone that is in manufacturing, and we'll call them level 1, like just getting into it, and they want to get to level 10, what would be some practical suggestions for, stepping up our game?
If you're going to get into manufacturing, you need to go buy a book called The Toyota Way. It is kind of the entrance to anybody who's doing modern manufacturing. If you go into any of us that have war stories from doing these plants or any of that kind of stuff, we all have a copy in our office. It's kind of the go-to starter book. And what it does is it explains the transition that happened in manufacturing 20, 30 years ago. What we force any person that we, or any plant that we're taking over, that we're starting to work with, I force them to explain their process in linear steps. And usually it'll be like 25 steps, and we'll try to get them down to 4 or 5. Okay, then let's start figuring out how to get it that simple. Because once you simplify it, it becomes similar to being a decent cook. If you take a decent cook and you give them pretty much any recipe, they're going to make it taste good. That's what a good manufacturer will do. They'll take the recipe from the engineer. They've got the baseline understanding of how the process works of manufacturing, and they will execute on that recipe and make the product well.